In the shadowy corners of a quaint English village, an elderly spinster's innocent hobby spirals into a deadly puzzle of betrayal and hidden motives. Welcome to Miss Marple and the Knitting Needle Conspiracy, a tale that will keep you guessing until the last stitch. Grab a cup of tea, take a seat, and enjoy the story. If you're hooked, subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us. Chapter 1. The Village Whispers. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking, rhythmically, like a metronome marking the pulse of secrets yet to be unravelled. The village, with its quaint thatched roofs, blooming rose gardens, and the distant chime of the church bell, seemed the picture of tranquility on that crisp autumn morning in 1952. But Miss Marple, with her soft white curls and deceptively mild, blue eyes, knew better than most that peace was often a facade, a delicate curtain hiding storms of human nature. She was no ordinary elderly spinster. Her mind was a steel trap, catching every stray glance, every whispered word, every inconsistency in the tapestry of village life. As she worked on a soft woolen scarf, its intricate cable pattern emerging, row by row, a sharp knock echoed at her door, breaking the quiet hum of her thoughts. It was Lucy Islesbarrow, the capable young housekeeper from Rutherford Hall, the grand manor on the village outskirts. Lucy's face was pale, her usually steady hands twisting nervously at her apron. "Miss Marple," she said in a hushed tone, glancing over her shoulder as if the hedgerows themselves might eavesdrop. "Something dreadful has happened at the Hall. Lady Constance is dead. Poisoned, they say, and the only clue is a broken knitting needle found clutched in her hand." Miss Marple set her needles down gently, her curiosity sharpening like a blade. Lady Constance, the wealthy widow who owned Rutherford Hall, was known for her sharp tongue, her secretive ways, and her iron grip on the village's social hierarchy. Poisoned? And a knitting needle? It was an odd pairing, one that tugged at the edges of Miss Marple's memory, hinting at something more than a simple accident. "Tell me everything, my dear," Miss Marple said, rising to pour tea from a china pot, the steam curling like a question mark in the air. She handed Lucy a cup, knowing the ritual of tea could steady even the most rattled nerves. Lucy took a sip and began to recount the events of the previous evening. Lady Constance had hosted her weekly knitting circle, a gathering that drew an eclectic mix of St. Mary Mead's residents. There was Mrs. Price Ridley, the vicar's wife, whose endless gossip about everyone's business was as sharp as her knitting needles. Colonel Bantry, gruff and retired, who attended mostly to humour his wife Dolly, but whose military eye missed little, and Mr. Elias Crowe, the new assistant to Dr. Haydock, a man whose polished manners and vague past made him an enigma in the village. The circle had started pleasantly enough, with the clink of teacups and the soft rustle of yarn. But as the evening wore on, tensions surfaced. Arguments broke out over knitting patterns. Mrs. Price Ridley accused someone of stealing her prized lace shawl design, and Lady Constance, ever the autocrat, had silenced the bickering with a cutting remark. Then, after sipping her evening sherry, she collapsed, her face contorted in pain, the broken knitting needle falling from her hand. Miss Marple leaned forward, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. A knitting needle wasn't a weapon, but it could be a symbol, a clue to something deeper, perhaps a code, a signal, or even a marker in a conspiracy. She recalled a case from years ago in London, where a seemingly innocent embroidery club had fronted a smuggling ring, using patterns to pass coded messages. Could something similar be at play here? The needle itself intrigued her most. Lucy described it as snapped in two, with faint etchings on the metal. Initials, perhaps, or a cryptic mark. Miss Marple's mind raced. Was it a deliberate clue, left by the killer, or an accident of the struggle? She resolved to see it for herself, but first, she needed to understand the players in this deadly game. "Let's consider the ordinary, Lucy," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "In a village like ours, the smallest details, a glance, a word, a habit, can unravel the grandest schemes. Like in knitting, a single dropped stitch can ruin the whole piece." She shared a practical tip for anyone facing a mystery. Start with what's familiar. Observe daily routines, listen to idle chatter, and question motives hidden in plain sight. For example, Mrs. Price Ridley's obsession with her knitting. Designs might seem petty, but what if it masked jealousy or a deeper grudge? Colonel Bantry's quiet presence might hide a keen observer who saw more than he let on. And Mr. Crow. Why would a man with city polish join a rural knitting circle unless he had an ulterior motive? Miss Marple decided to visit Rutherford Hall herself, under the guise of a concerned neighbour bearing a basket of homemade scones. The police, led by the overconfident Inspector Slack, had already dismissed the death as an accidental poisoning, perhaps from tainted sherry, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced. Slack was competent but lacked imagination, and she suspected. The needle pointed to something far more sinister, perhaps tied to wartime secrets or forbidden alliances that lingered in the village's quiet lanes. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple offered Lucy another piece of advice. "When you're puzzled, look at the people, not just the clues. People's habits, how they talk, what they hide, tell you more than any fingerprint." She recalled a story from her youth when a neighbour's sudden change in tea preferences revealed a secret affair, a small detail that cracked a larger scandal. In this case, the knitting circle's dynamics, petty rivalries, hushed whispers, and Lady Constance's domineering presence were threads she'd need to pull carefully. She packed her scone basket, her mind already mapping the hall's layout, from past visits, the grand drawing room where the circle met, the servants' quarters where gossip flowed, and the study where Lady Constance kept her private papers. The needle's etchings nagged at her. Could they be initials of a conspirator, or perhaps a reference to a forgotten wartime code? The war had ended 7 years ago, but its shadows lingered, especially in a village where everyone knew everyone's history, or thought they did. Miss Marple stepped out into the crisp air, her shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the village green. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a killer was hiding, their motives tangled in the ordinary rhythms of village life. The knitting needle was no accident. It was a challenge, a dare to unravel the truth. As she walked toward Rutherford Hall, the wind carried whispers of secrets yet to be uncovered, setting the stage for a deeper dive into the heart of the conspiracy. Chapter 2. Shadows at Rutherford Hall. Miss Jane Marple approached Rutherford Hall, her basket of scones swinging lightly on her arm, the gravel path crunching under her sensible shoes. The manor loomed ahead, its ivy-clad stone walls and tall, windows exuding an air of faded grandeur as if it held secrets in every crevice. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and Miss Marple felt a chill that had little to do with the breeze. She was here to observe, to listen, to let the house and its inhabitants reveal what the police had overlooked. Inspector Slack and his men were still milling about, their heavy boots trampling the flower beds, but Miss Marple knew the truth often lay in quieter corners. Servants' whispers, misplaced objects, or a glance that lingered too long. At the door, she was greeted by Mrs. Murgatroyd, the housekeeper, whose red-rimmed eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, ushering her into the grand foyer. "It's a terrible thing. Lady Constance, gone just like that." Her voice cracked, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands fidgeted with a lace handkerchief, as if she were holding back more than grief. The foyer was dim, its oak panelling absorbing the light, and a faint smell of polish mingled with something sharper, sherry perhaps, or something medicinal. Miss Marple offered her scones, which Mrs. Murgatroyd accepted with a distracted nod, and asked to pay her respects in the drawing-room where the tragedy had occurred. The housekeeper hesitated, then led the way, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The drawing-room was a study in opulence, with heavy velvet curtains, a gleaming mahogany table, and a fireplace where embers still glowed faintly. The knitting circle's remnants were scattered about, balls of yarn in muted greens and blues, a half-finished shawl draped over a chair, and a silver tray where the fatal sherry glass had stood. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the details. A single knitting needle, partnerless, lay on the rug near the fireplace, its tip slightly bent. It wasn't the broken one Lucy had described, but its presence felt deliberate, like a breadcrumb in a fairy tale. She bent to examine it, pretending to adjust her shawl, and saw no etchings, but its odd placement suggested someone had left it there after the chaos. Mrs. Murgatroyd hovered nearby, offering tea, but Miss Marple gently declined, steering the conversation to the knitting circle. "Such a shock," she said, her tone soft and sympathetic. "Who was here last night, besides the usual group?" The housekeeper rattled off names: Mrs. Price Ridley, Colonel Bantry, Mr. Elias Crowe, and, unexpectedly, Miss Lavinia Glyde, a reclusive spinster who rarely left her cottage. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Miss Glyde's presence was unusual. She was known for her herbal remedies and a quiet disdain for Lady Constance's high-handed ways. Why had she attended? Mrs. Murgatroyd, loosening under Miss Marple's gentle probing, mentioned that Miss Glyde had brought a bottle of homemade elderflower cordial, insisting it be served alongside the sherry. "Lady Constance didn't touch it," the housekeeper added quickly, "but it's still in the pantry if you'd like to see." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. A cordial could easily mask poison, especially if its maker knew her herbs. She moved to the window, ostensibly to admire the view, but really to study the room's layout. The sherry tray had been, near Lady Constance's chair, accessible to anyone in the circle. But who had poured the drink? She recalled Lucy mentioning a servant, young Tom, who'd been dismissed from the room before the collapse. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with him. Servants often saw what others missed. As she turned, her gaze fell on a small bookshelf in the corner, where a single book lay askew, a worn copy of a guide to British wildflowers. It seemed out of place among the novels and ledgers, and Miss Marple's fingers itched to open it, but Mrs. Murgatroyd's watchful eyes made her pause. Instead, she asked about Mr. Elias Crowe, the mysterious newcomer. Mrs. Murgatroyd's lips tightened. "He's polite enough, but too smooth, if you ask me. Always asking about the hall's history, poking about the old war records in the library." Miss Marple's mind sparked. War records. Rutherford Hall had been a convalescent home during the war, housing wounded soldiers and, rumour had it, the occasional intelligence officer. Could Crowe's interest be more than academic? She thanked Mrs. Murgatroyd and asked to see the pantry. where the elderflower cordial sat on a shelf, its pale liquid glinting in a glass bottle. Miss Marple didn't touch it, but noted its proximity to a row of cleaning supplies, including a small tin of rat poison, its label faded but legible. Careless housekeeping or a convenient clue? As she left the pantry, she overheard Inspector Slack in the hall, barking orders to his men. "Wrap it up, lads. Accidental poisoning, nothing more. The old bat probably mixed her own drink wrong." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Slack's haste was predictable, but it blinded him to the undercurrents she sensed. Rivalries in the knitting circle, Crow's curious inquiries, Miss Glyde's unexpected appearance. She decided to linger in the village, perhaps visit Miss Glyde's cottage, under the pretense of borrowing a recipe. As she stepped back into the fading daylight, the manor's shadow stretched across the lawn, mirroring the dark possibilities, taking shape in her mind. The knitting needle, the cordial, the war records, all were threads in a pattern she was only beginning to see, leading her deeper into the heart of St. Mary Mead's secrets. Chapter 3. The Cottage on the Hill. Miss Jane Marple made her way down the winding lane toward Miss Lavinia Glyde's cottage, her sturdy shoes tapping softly against the cobblestones. The village of St. Mary Mead was bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon, but the air carried a faint dampness, hinting at rain. Miss Glyde's cottage sat perched on a small hill, its stone walls overgrown with ivy, and its garden a riot of herbs and wildflowers. As if nature itself guarded her solitude, Miss Marple carried a small jar of her homemade gooseberry jam, a perfect excuse for a neighbourly visit, but her true purpose was to probe the reclusive spinster's unexpected presence at the fatal knitting circle. Lavinia Glyde was not one for social gatherings, and her elderflower cordial, untouched by Lady Constance, lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts like a loose stitch in a pattern. She knocked on the weathered door, noting the faint scent of lavender and something earthier, perhaps foxglove or hemlock, wafting from the garden. Miss Glyde opened the door, her thin frame wrapped in a faded shawl, her grey eyes sharp despite her age. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped but not unfriendly. "This is a surprise." Miss Marple smiled, offering the jam and mentioning a desire to swap recipes, a request no villager could easily refuse. Miss Glyde hesitated, then invited her inside. The cottage was small but tidy, its shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, their labels written in a precise hand. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on a small table where a half-finished knitting project lay. A delicate, lace scarf, its pattern intricate and unfamiliar. Over tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the knitting circle, her tone light but her eyes watchful. "I heard you attended Lady Constance's gathering," she said, stirring her cup. "Quite unlike you, Lavinia, to join such a lively group." Miss Glyde's fingers tightened around her teacup, and she gave a small, brittle laugh. "I went out of curiosity," she said. "Lady Constance insisted, said my skills would elevate the circle. I brought my cordial as a peace offering, but she turned her nose up at it." Her words were casual, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of resentment in her tone. Lady Constance's disdain for others was no secret, but had it stung Miss Glyde enough to prompt something darker? The cordial, Miss Marple recalled, sat near a tin of rat poison in the pantry, too close for comfort. As they chatted, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the knitting on the table. The lace pattern was complex, with tiny, deliberate knots that seemed almost coded, like a message woven into the fabric. "What a lovely design," she said, leaning closer. "Did you create it yourself?" Miss Glyde's expression softened, but only slightly. "An old family pattern," she replied, "passed down from my grandmother. It takes patience." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Patterns could hide secrets. She'd read of spies using tapestries to smuggle codes during the war. Could Miss Glyde's scarf be more than it seemed? She made a mental note to compare it to the shawl left in the drawing room at Rutherford Hall. The conversation turned to the village, and Miss Glyde mentioned Mr. Elias Crowe, the doctor's assistant, with a hint of suspicion. "He's been asking about my herbs," she said, her voice low. "Wanted to know about their properties, as if he doesn't trust Dr. Haydock's remedies." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Crowe's curiosity about the Hall's war records, and now Miss Glyde's herbs, suggested he was searching for something specific. Was he investigating or covering his own tracks? She recalled his polished demeanour at the knitting circle, so out of place among the villagers' homespun chatter. Miss Glyde, perhaps sensing she'd said too much, changed the subject to the weather. But Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twitched, as if itching to hide something. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced at a small wooden box on a shelf, its lid carved with a faint floral design. It seemed out of place among the jars, too ornate for everyday use. "What a charming box," she said, hoping to draw a reaction. Miss Glyde's face tightened, and she quickly said, "Just an old keepsake," before guiding Miss Marple to the door. Outside, the sky had darkened, and a soft drizzle began to fall. Miss Marple thanked her hostess and stepped into the rain, her mind buzzing. The cottage, with its herbs and mysterious patterns, felt like a piece of the puzzle. But how did it connect to the broken knitting needle or Lady Constance's death? Miss Glyde's guarded demeanour suggested she knew more than she let on, but whether as victim, witness or culprit, Miss Marple couldn't yet say. Walking back to the village, she passed the churchyard, where a figure stood under an umbrella near an old gravestone. It was Colonel Bantry, his military posture unmistakable even in the dim light. He tipped his hat as she approached, but his face was grim. "Bad business at the Hall," he said, his voice low. "I saw something odd that night, Miss Marple." Crowe, slipping a small notebook into his pocket after the chaos started, didn't think much of it then, but now. He trailed off, his eyes scanning the horizon. Miss Marple thanked him, her thoughts spinning. A notebook, herbs, a coded scarf. The threads were multiplying, each pointing to a deeper conspiracy. As she headed home, the rain pattering on her umbrella, she knew her next step was to find young Tom, the servant who'd poured the sherry, and see what secrets he might unwittingly hold. Chapter 4. The Servant's Tale, Miss. Jane Marple trudged through the drizzle back to the heart of St. Mary Mead, her umbrella shielding her from the rain, but not from the swirl of questions in her mind. The village was quiet now, its windows glowing, faintly as families settled in for the evening, but the weight of unspoken secrets hung heavier than the storm clouds above. She headed toward the Blue Boar, the local pub where young Tom, the servant from Rutherford Hall, often lingered after his duties. Tom was a lanky lad of 19, known for his quick hands and quicker tongue, always ready with a cheeky remark. If anyone had seen something overlooked in the chaos of Lady Constance's death, it would be him, the one who'd poured the sherry before being sent out of the room. The Blue Boar was warm and smoky, its low beams and worn tables filled with the hum of local chatter. Miss Marple spotted Tom in a corner, nursing a pint and staring into the fire, his usual grin absent. She approached, her demeanour as unassuming as ever, and offered a kind smile. "Tom, my dear, might I have a word?" she asked, settling into a chair beside him. The boy started, then relaxed, his shoulders slumping. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I suppose you're here about the hall. Everyone's talking about it." She nodded, her eyes gentle but piercing, encouraging him to speak without pressing too hard. Over a cup of tea she ordered for herself, Tom began to share his story, his words tumbling out like yarn from a skein. He'd been in the drawing room that night, serving tea and sherry to the knitting circle. Lady Constance had been in a foul mood, snapping at him for spilling a drop on the tray. "She was always like that," Tom said, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "But that night she was worse. Kept watching Mr. Crow like he was up to something." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Crow again, his name weaving through every thread of this mystery. Tom continued, describing how he'd poured the sherry from a decanter on the sideboard as instructed and handed it to Lady Constance. But then, just before she took her fatal sip, Miss Glyde had offered her elderflower cordial instead. Lady Constance waved it off, rude as you like, Tom said she didn't trust homemade concoctions. Then she sent me out to fetch more coal, and that's when it happened. Miss Marple leaned forward, her mind snagging on a detail. The decanter, was it always on the sideboard, or had someone placed it there that evening? Tom frowned, thinking. "It's usually in the dining room," he said slowly, "but someone must have moved it. I didn't think to check." His eyes widened, as if realizing the implications. Miss Marple kept her expression neutral, but her thoughts raced. A moved decanter suggested premeditation. Someone had ensured the sherry was within reach, perhaps, laced with poison before Tom even poured it. She asked about the others in the room. Tom described Mrs. Price Ridley fussing over her yarn, muttering about stolen patterns, and Colonel Bantry sitting quietly, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting trouble. Crow, though, had been oddly active, offering to help Tom with the tray, a task beneath his polished exterior. "Did Mr. Crow touch the decanter?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft as a whisper. Tom hesitated, then nodded. He adjusted it on the tray, said it was wobbling. "I thought he was just being fussy." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. Crow's interference, however small, was another stitch in the pattern. She asked Tom about anything else unusual, a glance, a gesture, an object out of place. He scratched his head, then mentioned a small scrap of paper he'd seen on the floor near Lady Constance's chair, crumpled and overlooked in the chaos. "I picked it up after the police left," he admitted, fishing it from his pocket. It was a torn fragment, no bigger than a postage stamp, with a faint pencil sketch of what looked like a knitting needle crossed with a flower. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The sketch resembled the etchings Lucy had described on the broken needle, a clue, perhaps, to its significance. She thanked Tom, slipping him a shilling for his trouble, and tucked the paper scrap into her handbag. As she stepped back into the rain, the pub's warmth fading behind her, she felt the mystery tightening like a knot. The decanter's relocation, Crow's meddling, the cryptic sketch, all pointed to a deliberate act, not a careless accident. But why a knitting needle? Was it a signature, a taunt, or something more? A link to a past no one in St. Mary Mead dared speak of? She recalled Colonel Bantry's mention of Crow's notebook, seen after the collapse. Could it hold answers, or was it another distraction? Miss Marple decided her next move was to speak with Mrs. Price Ridley, whose obsession with her knitting designs might hide a motive, or a witness to Crow's actions. As she walked home, The village lights blurred. In the rain, each glowing window a reminder that secrets were rarely as hidden as they seemed. Chapter 5. The Pattern of Envy. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage the next morning, the faint patter of rain against her windows a steady companion as she sipped her morning tea. The scrap of paper Tom had given her lay on the table, its pencil, sketch of a knitting needle and flower taunting her with its cryptic meaning. She had decided to visit Mrs. Price Ridley, the vicar's wife, whose sharp tongue and obsession with her knitting designs had been a focal point of tension at the fatal knitting circle. If anyone held a grudge against Lady Constance, it might be her. And Miss Marple knew that envy could unravel even the most tightly knit facades. She donned her coat, tucked the scrap into her handbag, and set off for the vicarage, the village waking slowly under a grey sky. The vicarage was a modest house, its garden neat but unremarkable, a reflection of Mrs. Price Ridley's practical nature. Miss Marple knocked, and the door was opened by the woman herself, her angular face set in a frown that softened only slightly at the sight of her visitor. "Miss Marple, what brings you here?" she asked, her voice clipped as she gestured toward the parlour. The room was cluttered with knitting supplies, skeins of yarn in muted colours, a basket of needles, and a stack of pattern books, one of which lay open to a lace shawl design that caught Miss Marple's eye. It was strikingly similar to the scarf she'd seen at Miss Glyde's cottage, though less intricate. She complimented the work, easing Mrs. Price Ridley into conversation, knowing flattery could loosen even the tightest lips. Over a pot of strong tea, Mrs. Price Ridley vented about the knitting circle. Lady Constance was insufferable, she said, her eyes flashing, always acting superior, as if her patterns were the only ones worth knitting. She had the nerve to call my shawl design pedestrian. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, noting the woman's clenched fists. The argument over patterns which Tom had mentioned seemed more than petty. It was personal. Mrs. Price Ridley went on, describing how she'd spent months perfecting her shawl, only to hear whispers that Lady Constance had shown a similar design to a London shop, claiming it as her own. "I confronted her that night," she admitted, her voice dropping. "She laughed it off, said I was imagining things. But I saw her showing Mr. Crowe a sketch, whispering like they were plotting." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A sketch? Could it be related to the one Tom found? She asked, as casually as she could, if Mrs. Price Ridley had noticed anything odd about Crowe's behaviour. The vicar's wife sniffed, her disdain clear. "He was too interested in everyone's business," she said. "Kept asking about my patterns, saying they reminded him of something he'd seen abroad. Abroad. As if I'd copy some foreign nonsense." Her words sparked a memory in Miss Marple. During the war, coded messages were sometimes hidden in seemingly innocent designs, like quilts or tapestries. Could Crowe's interest suggest he recognized a code in the knitting patterns, perhaps one tied to the needle's etchings? She steered the conversation to the night of the tragedy, probing gently. Mrs. Price Ridley recalled the tension in the room, how Lady Constance had dominated the circle, dismissing Miss Glyde's cordial and even Colonel Bantry's attempt at humour. "Then she took that sherry," Mrs. Price Ridley said, her voice tightening, "and collapsed before my eyes. I thought it was a fit at first, but then I saw the needle in her hand, snapped clean in two." Miss Marple asked if she'd seen anyone near the sherry tray before Tom poured it. Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated, then said, "Crowe was hovering nearby, adjusting his cufflinks like he was nervous. And Miss Glyde." She kept glancing at the tray, though she never touched it. The accusation hung in the air, but Miss Marple sensed Mrs. Price Ridley was deflecting, her own resentment of Lady Constance too raw to ignore. As they finished their tea, Miss Marple noticed a small notebook on a side table, its leather cover worn but embossed with a faint floral motif, similar to the box at Miss Glyde's cottage. "What a charming notebook," she said, hoping to draw a reaction. Mrs. Price Ridley's face stiffened, and she quickly tucked it away. "Just my knitting notes," she said, too quickly. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was racing. Was it a coincidence, or did the notebook connect to Crow's, the one Colonel Bantry had seen him pocket? She thanked Mrs. Price Ridley and left, promising to share a scone recipe, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The shawl designs, the sketch, the notebook, all suggested a hidden language, one that Lady Constance might have stumbled upon, knowingly or not. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the village streets slick and reflective. Miss Marple paused, by the church, her eyes drawn to the spire against the clearing sky. Mrs. Price Ridley's bitterness was a motive, but not proof. Crow's actions, though, were increasingly suspicious. His interest in patterns, his proximity to the sherry, his notebook. And Miss Glyde's role remained unclear. Her cordial and her intricate scarf hinted at knowledge she wasn't sharing. Miss Marple decided her next step was to speak with Colonel Bantry, whose quiet observation might reveal more about Crow's notebook and the night's events. As she walked toward his home, the village seemed to hold its breath, its secrets, waiting to be unpicked like a stubborn knot. Chapter 6. The Colonel's Memory Miss. Jane Marple made her way to Colonel Bantry's home, her steps deliberate as she navigated the damp cobblestones of St. Mary Mead. The sky had cleared, leaving a crisp evening air that sharpened her senses. The Colonel's house, a sturdy red brick affair with neatly trimmed hedges, stood at the edge of the village, its windows glowing with the promise of a warm hearth. Miss Marple knew the Colonel as a man of few words, but keen observation, his military past lending him a knack for noticing details others overlooked. His mention of Mr. Elias Crow's notebook, glimpsed in the chaos of Lady Constance's death, had lodged in her mind like a burr. If anyone could shed light on Crow's actions that night, it was Colonel Bantry. Dolly Bantry, the Colonel's cheerful wife, answered the door, her face lighting up at the sight of Miss Marple. "Jane, what a treat!" she exclaimed, ushering her into the sitting room, where the Colonel sat by the fire, a glass of whisky in hand. His weathered face broke into a rare smile as he rose to greet her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but warm, "I suppose you're here about the business at Rutherford Hall. Nasty affair." She nodded, settling into a chintz-covered chair, and wasted no time. "Colonel, you mentioned seeing Mr. Crow with a notebook that night. Could you tell me more?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any flicker of memory. The Colonel took a sip of his whisky, his gaze drifting to the fire as he gathered his thoughts. He described the knitting circle's final moments, the room thick with tension, Lady Constance's sharp words cutting through the chatter, and the sudden hush as she collapsed. "It was pandemonium," he said, his voice low. People shouting, Mrs. Price Ridley shrieking about poison, Miss Glyde frozen like a statue. But Crow, he was calm, too calm. I saw him slip a small notebook into his coat pocket as he moved, toward the door, like he didn't want anyone to notice. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her handbag. The notebook again, its presence weaving through the mystery like a recurring motif. She asked what the notebook looked like. The Colonel frowned, rubbing his chin. Small, leather-bound, with some sort of design on the cover. Maybe a flower or a crest. Couldn't see clearly in the dim light. The description matched the one she'd glimpsed at Mrs. Price Ridley's and possibly the box at Miss Glyde's cottage. A pattern was emerging, but its meaning remained elusive. Miss Marple pressed further, asking if Crow had done anything else unusual. The Colonel leaned back, his eyes narrowing. He was watching Lady Constance all evening, he said. Not obviously, mind you, but I've seen that look before, on men sizing up an opponent. And when young Tom brought the sherry tray, Crow was quick to step in, steadying it like he was looking for an excuse to get close. Miss Marple's mind raced. Crow's proximity to the sherry tray aligned with Tom's account, but the Colonel's observation added a new layer. Intent. She asked if he'd noticed anything else in the room, perhaps near Lady Constance's chair. The Colonel paused, then mentioned a small velvet pouch that had fallen under the table during the chaos. I thought it was hers, he said, but no one claimed it. The police didn't seem interested, so I left it there. A pouch? Miss Marple's curiosity flared. It could hold anything. Yarn, needles, or something far more incriminating, like a vial of poison. She made a mental note to check the drawing room again, if she could find a way back to Rutherford Hall. The conversation turned to the other members of the circle. The Colonel had little to say about Miss Glyde, calling her a queer fish, always muttering about her herbs. But he was more vocal about Mrs. Price Ridley. She was in a right state that night, he said, going on about her precious shawl design being stolen. I reckon she'd have throttled Lady Constance herself if she could have. Miss Marple smiled faintly, recognizing the exaggeration, but noting the underlying truth. Envy was a powerful motive, and Mrs. Price Ridley's bitterness was a thread worth following. As for Crow, the Colonel admitted he didn't trust him. Too slick, he said. Claims he's Dr. Haydock's assistant, but he's got the air of a man who's seen more than a village surgery. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced at a framed photograph on the mantel. A younger Colonel Bantry in uniform, standing with a group of soldiers outside Rutherford Hall during its wartime days as a convalescent home. You were stationed there, weren't you? She asked, her tone casual. The Colonel nodded, his face softening. Briefly, in 44. Odd place, full of whispers about spies and coded messages. Never saw anything myself, but you know how rumours fly. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The war again, its shadow stretching over the present. Could Crow's notebook and the needle's etchings be relics of that time, tied to secrets buried in the hall's past? She thanked the Bantrys and stepped into the cool night, the village now cloaked in darkness. The Colonel's account had tightened the web. Crow's notebook, the velvet pouch, the wartime rumours. Each was a clue, but the pattern was still incomplete. Miss Marple decided her next move was to return to Rutherford Hall, to find that pouch and perhaps uncover more about the hall's history. As she walked home, the stars above St. Mary Mead seemed to watch, silent witnesses to a conspiracy unravelling stitch by stitch. Chapter 7. The Hidden Pouch. Miss. Jane Marple slipped back into Rutherford Hall under the pretence of returning a borrowed recipe book to Mrs. Murgatroyd, the housekeeper. The manor was quieter now, the police having retreated to their station, leaving only a faint air of disruption in the grand halls. The late morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long, dappled patterns on the polished floors. But Miss Marple's focus was singular. The velvet pouch Colonel Bantry had mentioned, left unclaimed beneath the drawing-room table. Its presence nagged at her, a loose thread in the intricate weave of Lady Constance's death. She carried a small basket of apples as an excuse, her eyes sharp behind her unassuming smile, ready to notice what others had overlooked. Mrs. Murgatroyd greeted her with weary politeness, her face still drawn from the recent tragedy. "You're too kind, Miss Marple," she said, accepting the apples with a distracted nod. Miss Marple mentioned the recipe book, claiming she'd left it in the drawing room during her last visit, and asked if she might retrieve it. The housekeeper, preoccupied with a stack of linens, waved her toward the room without suspicion. The drawing room was much as it had been, though tidier now, with the knitting circle's remnants cleared away. The mahogany table gleamed, the fireplace was cold, and the sherry tray was gone, likely confiscated by Inspector Slack's men. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the floor beneath the table where Lady Constance had sat. She knelt, feigning a dropped hairpin, and peered into the shadows. There it was, a small velvet pouch, no bigger than a coin purse, tucked against the table leg, its deep green fabric blending with the rug's pattern. Miss Marple retrieved it, her movements swift but careful, and slipped it into her handbag. Before rising, she felt a prickle of excitement. The pouch was heavier than expected, its contents shifting slightly with a faint clink. She didn't dare open it here, under Mrs. Murgatroyd's occasional glances. But its weight suggested something more than yarn or needles. Perhaps a key, a locket, or something tied to the cryptic sketch Tom had found. As she lingered, pretending, to search for the non-existent book, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a framed photograph on the wall, one she hadn't noticed before. It showed Rutherford Hall during the war, its lawns filled with uniformed men and nurses, a stark contrast to its current elegance. One figure stood out, a young woman in a nurse's cap, her face turned slightly away, but her posture reminded Miss Marple of someone familiar. Could it be a younger Miss Glyde? Or perhaps a relative? The Hall's wartime role as a convalescent home kept surfacing, its secrets entwined with the present. She made a mental note to ask Dolly Bantry about the photograph, as her husband's. Wartime memories might hold clues. Mrs. Murgatroyd returned, apologizing for the delay, and Miss Marple seized the chance to ask about the Hall's history. "It must have been lively during the war," she said, her tone conversational. The housekeeper nodded, her expression softening. "Oh, it was. Soldiers, nurses, even some odd types. Government men, I heard, though I was just a maid then. They kept to the library, always whispering." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. The library, where Crow had been poking about, according to Mrs. Murgatroyd's earlier remark. Could it hold records or documents linked to the notebook or the needle's etchings? She thanked the housekeeper and left, promising to return, with a jar of her marmalade. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, the pouch in her hands. She opened it carefully, revealing a small silver locket, its surface engraved with a delicate flower motif that matched the sketch Tom had given her. Inside was a faded photograph of a young man in a military uniform, his face serious but unfamiliar. Tucked behind it was a folded scrap of paper with a single word written in a shaky hand: "Traitor." Miss Marple's breath caught. The word was a spark, igniting questions about betrayal, perhaps tied to the war, to Lady Constance, or to someone in the knitting circle. The locket's flower design echoed the etchings on the broken needle, suggesting a deliberate connection. But to what end? She leaned back, her knitting needles idle in her lap as she pieced together the fragments. The pouch, hidden but not taken, implied someone had dropped it in haste. Crow, perhaps, or Miss Glyde, whose cottage held a similar floral motif. The word traitor hinted at a grudge from the past, possibly linked to the Hall's wartime secrets. Miss Marple recalled the Colonel's mention of spies and coded messages, and the photograph in the drawing room nagged at her. Her next step was clear. She needed to visit the library at Rutherford Hall, where Crow's curiosity and the house's history might intersect. As the afternoon light faded, she felt the conspiracy tightening, its threads pulling her toward a truth buried in the shadows of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 8. The Library's Secrets. Miss Jane Marple stepped into the library at Rutherford Hall, her excuse a vague inquiry about borrowing a book on local history for her nephew, Raymond. The morning was bright, the sun streaming through the tall, arched windows, illuminating rows of leather-bound volumes and a faint layer of dust that spoke of neglect. Mrs. Murgatroyd had let her in with minimal fuss, preoccupied with preparations for Lady Constance's memorial service. Miss Marple's true purpose, however, was to explore the library where Mr. Elias Crow had been seen poking about, as Mrs. Murgatroyd had mentioned. The locket and its cryptic note, "Traitor," weighed heavily in her handbag alongside the sketch of the needle and flower. She sensed the library held answers, perhaps in forgotten records or hidden corners, that could tie the wartime past to the present mystery. The room was vast, its high ceilings and oak shelves giving it a cathedral-like hush. A long table ran down the centre, cluttered with old ledgers and a few scattered papers, as if someone had been searching and left in a hurry. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the shelves, noting titles on gardening, military history, and, curiously, a worn volume on cryptography tucked among novels. She pulled it out, its pages yellowed but intact, and found handwritten notes in the margins, faint diagrams of grids and symbols, not unlike the lace patterns she'd seen at Miss Glyde's cottage. Her heart quickened. Codes hidden in knitting patterns were not unheard of during the war, when spies used everyday objects to pass messages. Could the broken needle's etchings be part of such a code? As she leafed through the book, a loose sheet slipped out, a faded letter dated 1944, addressed to C. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, mentioning a delivery to be concealed in the usual pattern. The signature was smudged, but the tone suggested secrecy, perhaps tied to the Hall's wartime role as a convalescent home. Miss Marple tucked the letter into her handbag, her mind racing. C could be Constance, or perhaps Crow, whose interest in the library now seemed less academic and more deliberate. She moved to the ledgers on the table, flipping through one labelled Rutherford Hall, 1943-1945. It listed supplies for the convalescent home, bandages, medicines, even knitting wool for the nurses' morale projects. One entry caught her eye, a shipment of special needles ordered by a nurse Glyde. Glyde. Could it be Miss Lavinia's relative, perhaps the woman in the photograph she'd seen in the drawing room? The sound of footsteps broke her focus. She closed the ledger just as Mr. Elias Crow entered, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile smooth, but his eyes wary. "I didn't expect to find you here." She returned his smile, feigning surprise. "Just looking for a book for my nephew," she said, holding up a random volume. Crow nodded, but his gaze flicked to the ledgers, betraying a flicker of unease. He mentioned helping Dr. Haydock organize old medical records, but his excuse felt thin, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand lingered near his coat pocket, where the Colonel had seen him slip a notebook. "This place is full of history," she said lightly, watching his reaction. "Especially from the war. Such intriguing times." Crow's smile tightened, and he murmured something about busy schedules before excusing himself. Alone again, Miss Marple moved to a corner where a small cabinet stood, its lock scratched as if recently tampered with. She tested the door, and it creaked open, revealing a bundle of yellowed papers tied with string. Among them was a photograph of a group of nurses and soldiers, one of whom bore a striking resemblance to a younger Miss Glyde, her face stern beside a man in an officer's uniform, the same man from the locket in the velvet pouch. Miss Marple's pulse raced. The pieces were aligning: the locket, the letter, the wartime records, and Crow's persistent presence in the library. She slipped the photograph into her handbag, careful to leave the cabinet as she found it. As she left the library, the hall's quiet grandeur felt oppressive, its walls holding secrets that refused to stay buried. The letter's mention of a pattern and the ledger's reference to Nurse Glyde suggested a conspiracy rooted in the war, perhaps involving betrayal or espionage. Crow's behavior, his notebook, his interest in the library, made him a central figure. But was he, hunter or hunted? Miss Marple decided her next move was to confront Miss Glyde about the photograph and the wartime connection, hoping to unravel the thread tying the past to Lady Constance's death. As she stepped into the sunlight, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed to watch her, its calm facade hiding a storm of secrets waiting to be exposed. Chapter 9. The Past. Unravelled. Miss Jane Marple walked briskly toward Miss Lavinia Glyde's cottage, the photograph from Rutherford Hall's library tucked safely in her handbag alongside the cryptic letter and the locket. The early afternoon sun cast a soft glow over St. Mary Mead, but the warmth did little to ease the chill of suspicion settling in her bones. The photograph, showing a younger Miss Glyde beside a soldier who matched the locket's image, hinted at a wartime story that might explain the needle, the poison, and the word traitor. Miss Marple's mind spun with possibilities. Had Miss Glyde been part of something clandestine during the war, and had Lady Constance's death been a reckoning for past sins? She carried a small posy of roses as a pretext for her visit, her expression serene, but her senses alert. Miss Glyde answered the door, her grey eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of her visitor. "Miss Marple, twice in 1 week," she said, her voice dry but not hostile. "To what do I owe this?" Miss Marple offered the roses, mentioning a shared love of gardening, and was invited inside. The cottage was as she remembered: shelves of herbs, the faint scent of lavender, and the intricate lace scarf still on the table, its pattern hauntingly similar to the cryptographic diagrams she'd seen in the library. They sat with tea, and Miss Marple steered the conversation to the war, her tone gentle but probing. "Rutherford Hall must have been quite a place back then," she said. "All those nurses and soldiers. Did you ever visit during that time?" Miss Glyde's hand paused mid-sip, her cup trembling slightly. "I was young then," she said, her voice tight. "My cousin, Eleanor, was a nurse there. I helped her, sometimes, delivering herbs for the patients." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes catching the flicker of unease in Miss Glyde's face. She reached into her handbag and, with deliberate care, produced the photograph. "I found this in the Hall's library," she said, laying it on the table. "Is this Eleanor? She looks so like you." Miss Glyde's face paled, her fingers brushing the image of the young nurse beside the soldier. "Yes, that's Eleanor," she whispered, then fell silent, her gaze distant. Sensing an opening, Miss Marple pressed gently. "And the man beside her? He seems familiar." She didn't mention the locket, but her words hung in the air like a challenge. Miss Glyde's lips tightened, and after a long pause, she spoke. That was Captain Richard Harrow, a patient at the hall. He and Eleanor were close. Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of old pain. She asked about Harrow's fate, and Miss Glyde's eyes darkened. He died in 44. An accident, they said, but Eleanor never believed it. She thought he'd been betrayed, caught up in something dangerous. Miss Marple's mind raced. Betrayed, like the note in the locket. Could Harrow's death be the key to the conspiracy? She shifted the conversation to the knitting circle, mentioning the broken needle found with Lady Constance. Such an odd clue, she said, watching Miss Glyde's reaction. The older woman's fingers twitched, and she reached for her scarf, as if to steady herself. Knitting needles break easily, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple noted the scarf's pattern again, its knots and loops eerily similar to the coded grids in the library book. Your patterns are so intricate, she said, almost like a code. Miss Glyde's eyes flashed, but she quickly masked it with a laugh. Just an old family trick, she said, echoing her earlier words. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. The scarf, the needle, the wartime letter, all pointed to a hidden message. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced at the wooden box on the shelf, its floral carving matching the locket's design. That box is lovely, she said, hoping to draw a reaction. Miss Glyde's face hardened, and she stood abruptly. It's nothing special, she said, guiding Miss Marple to the door. Outside, the village was quiet, the roses in Miss Glyde's garden swaying in the breeze. Miss Marple's thoughts churned as she walked away. Eleanor Glyde, Captain Harrow, a possible betrayal. Had Lady Constance known something about Harrow's death, perhaps uncovered in her own wartime records? And where did Crow fit in, with his notebook and his probing questions? The scarf's pattern nagged at her, its complexity suggesting more than mere craft. Miss Marple decided her next move was to confront Mr. Elias Crow directly, to gauge his reaction to the locket and the photograph. His interest in the library and Miss Glyde's herbs made him a pivotal figure, but whether he was a villain or a seeker of truth remained unclear. As she headed toward Dr. Haydock's surgery, where Crow worked, the village seemed to close, ranks around its secrets, each step pulling her closer to the heart of the conspiracy. Chapter 10. The Final Stitch Miss. Jane Marple sat in Dr. Haydock's small surgery, her handbag resting on her lap, the locket, photograph, and cryptic letter nestled within. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the hum of village life filtered through the window as she waited for Mr. Elias Crow. Her visit was under the pretense of a minor ailment, a touch of rheumatism, she claimed, but her true aim was to confront Crow and unravel the threads of the conspiracy that had led to Lady Constance's death. The clues had woven a complex pattern: the broken knitting needle with its etched flower, the locket's note reading "traitor," the wartime photograph, and Miss Glyde's coded scarf. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever, had begun to see the design, and Crow, with his notebook and probing ways, was the final piece. Crow entered, his polished demeanour intact, but his eyes wary as he greeted her. "Miss Marple, feeling under the weather?" he asked, his tone too smooth. She smiled, her voice mild but her gaze piercing. "Just a small matter, but I'd like a word about Rutherford Hall." Before he could protest, she placed the locket on the table, its floral engraving glinting in the light. Crow's face tightened, a flicker of recognition betraying him. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone steady. "Near Lady Constance's chair, along with a note that says, 'Traitor.' I believe you know what it means, Mr. Crow. Or should I say, Captain Harrow's son?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. Crow's shoulders slumped, and he sank into a chair, his facade crumbling. He admitted he was Richard Harrow's son, born after the captain's death in 1944, raised by his mother in London. He had come to St. Mary Mead seeking answers about his father's supposed accident at Rutherford Hall, which his mother believed was murder. "I found letters," he said, his voice raw. "They suggested my father was betrayed, his work for British intelligence compromised. The knitting needle was his, a signal used by his unit to mark safe drops during the war. I recognized its etching at the circle and knew someone there was involved." Miss Marple nodded, the pieces falling into place. She revealed the photograph of Nurse Eleanor Glyde and Captain Harrow, and the letter mentioning a delivery hidden in a pattern. "Miss Glyde's cousin Eleanor was part of it, wasn't she?" she asked. Crow confirmed. Eleanor had been his father's contact, using knitting patterns to encode messages about German troop movements. But Lady Constance, then a volunteer at the hall, had grown suspicious, intercepting a message and threatening to expose the operation unless paid to keep silent. Harrow's death, staged as an accident, was her doing. She had poisoned him with a dose from the hall's medical supplies, fearing his work would draw attention to her own profiteering from wartime shortages. The broken needle, Crow explained, was a warning left by Eleanor, who had survived the war and passed it to her cousin Lavinia. Miss Glyde, unaware of the full story, had joined the knitting circle at Lady Constance's insistence, perhaps to taunt her with the past. The scarf's pattern, with its coded knots, was Eleanor's design, a silent accusation that Lady Constance recognized, driving her to confront Miss Glyde that night. But Crow had acted first. "I poisoned the sherry," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I slipped cyanide into the decanter before Tom poured it. I meant to expose her, but when she laughed about my father, I couldn't stop myself." The notebook, he admitted, contained his research on the hall's wartime records, which he'd been compiling to prove his father's betrayal. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her resolve was firm. "You've carried a heavy burden, but murder is no justice." She had already alerted Inspector Slack, who, despite his bluster, was waiting outside with 2 constables. As they entered, Crow stood, his face resigned, and allowed himself to be led away. Miss Marple remained, her thoughts turning to Miss Glyde, whose scarf had unwittingly sparked the confrontation. She would visit her later to explain Eleanor's role and offer comfort for the pain of the past. As she stepped into the evening light of St. Mary Mead, the village seemed to exhale, its secrets laid bare. The knitting needle, a relic of wartime bravery, had unravelled a conspiracy of greed and betrayal, with Lady Constance's death as its final stitch. Miss Marple walked home, her heart heavy but her mind clear, knowing justice, however imperfect, had been served. For those who followed this tale, if you've enjoyed the twists and turns, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us.